All right, let me stop messing around. What's up, people? Um, as you can see, I'm coming to you live from my kid's bedroom, but you got to do it any way you can do it. Um, the purpose of this talk. Welcome to another installment of Afrofuturism, Europa Afrofuturism lectures, transmissions, downloads, uh, inspired yaps, raps, whatever. Conversation, delayed conversation by the time you see this. Um, and the purpose of this talk is to kind of be a bridge between uh, the lecture from last week about Eurocentric hegemonic futures and kind of mainstream corporate futurism, and our conversation around music and Black music and Afrofuturism. And so I want to look at the work of, actually, before I say that, let me say this. What I also want to do in these talks, in addition to bridging last week and this coming week, is I want to look at trends, concepts, and developments from corporate and Eurocentric futures that actually might be useful for us to either be aware of, to adapt, or to take elements from, or to kind of use as lenses, either to look at either through an Afrofuturistic lens or use as lenses to look at Afrofuturism, depending. That was why I kind of had this whole thing going on. So yeah, so that's kind of our purpose. So it has both a bridge function, and this is kind of part of a series that will be developed over time. So the thinkers and concepts that I want to look at are coming from chiefly from this gentleman, William Irwin Thompson. He's got a book here called Transforming History, a curriculum for cultural evolution. This was written in the early 2000s. And also here, a little bit less than this one, At the Edge of History, Passages About the Earth. Um, this was written in the early 70s. So anyway, yesterday's future. And also a little bit of Naomi Klein's No Logo, also written in the early 2000s. And we've taken working with some of those concepts from both of these folks, and kind of directing it towards Afrofuturistic inquiry, concern, imagination. So with that, I'm going to invite any listeners or viewers to sit with me for a moment. And you might imagine the presences of your ancestors behind you, especially your well and wise ancestors, your ancestors who are ready to contribute towards liberation. And in front of you, you might imagine future beings, children of tomorrow, whether of blood or of mind or soul. And now seeing yourself between them, feeling your seat between them. Breathing into the fullness of the space. There's animals in the back. And knowing that this present moment is really all the time that we have. So take a bow. Okay, so let's get into it. Of technology, I now have a partner here that is going to try to translate the spoken word into text as I speak it. Anyways, okay, so the title of this talk is Noetic Polities and Black Cultures. And this term, Noetic Polities, was first brought to my attention by this gentleman on your left, William Irwin Thompson. His books I showed you a second ago. And Noetic Polities, well, before I get into trying to that term, describe that term, just to tell you a little bit about Thompson. So Thompson calls himself a cultural historian. And with that, the way that he understands that is he is using literature primarily, actually, as his basis. He's looking at literatures of different societies throughout history as a way to kind of understand the mental and psychological and even the spiritual makeup um, of different peoples throughout different historical moments. Um, yeah, so he really studies mythology, he studies poetry, he studies epic literature, and he studies kind of like literature comment, right? Whether that's biography or fiction or nonfiction and so on. And he is originally from Los Angeles, and that's important actually as we go on. But he's moved now to the East Coast. He started something called I think it's the Lindenfair Institute, which he was really trying to bring together scholars from different disciplines, and whether they be in the sciences, particularly ecological and system sciences, or scholars who were working on literature or poetry, or artists and musicians, or spiritual teachers, and he really tried to bring them together with the thought that through some kind of collective synergy, they could really kind of birth futures of thinking, futures of art, futures of science, and futures of culture. So William Irwin Thompson, he did most of his writing. He's still active, but the bulk of his writing really starting from the 70s and going to the late 90s. Um, so, so kind of let's take a look at some of these terms just on a kind of vocab level first. So this term noetic, you may or may not be familiar with noetic. Sounds like poetic, but also sounds like gnosis or knowledge, right? Those of you who are taking Sanskrit, you might recognize the root there. So noetic refers to the mind, but it's not just the discursive mind, right? It's not just the kind of critical intellect. It's actually sort of the visionary mind, or like the mind that can perceive phenomenon as wholes and kind of know things instantaneously, right? It's more like intuition rather than it is like uh, a, a steady and kind of paced logic, right? So in like Egyptian cosmology, you might call it the Ka, right? It's the part of our spirit that sort of understands instantly and relates to cosmic patterns and cosmic rhythms. So, polities, this term really looks at like systems of governance or political systems. And it's really kind of refers to like any way that human beings come together and organize themselves, right? Both all these terms are Greek, right? He's a Western kind of counter Western historian, right? Counterculture Western historian. So that actually might also be useful to some of you all who are in this class and who are not necessarily of African descent, as he could be a possible model of like non-hegemonic Euro futures. Anyway, so, and then the last title I think is kind of relevant here is this word ecumene, which we actually have in our Naropa mission statement, ecumenical. And its original meaning was a sort of universal civilization that was under like Christian Rome. And it later came to refer to the European cultural hegemony that we discussed kind of in the last lecture. And this is that same hegemony that's projecting a lot of our futures. And also, it's now come to mean this idea of a universal world civilization that may or may not be under a European hegemony. So I don't think the idea has really been sufficiently freed from this sort of Eurocentric universalism, but I just put it out there because I think it's important for our understanding here. So Thompson works with this concept of he calls cultural ecologies, right? And the cultural ecology, he says, is right like any society has a system of organization. It has stories that either justify the organization or that the organization is an enactment of. It has laws, it has customs, it has a worldview, it has an economic base, it has a way that it gains or derives its sustenance from Earth and distributes its sustenance amongst the society. And every one of those economies and every one of those polities is actually embedded in an ecosystem. And in a way, it is an ecosystem or it's intertwined with the Earth's ecosystem, right? So the economy and the ecology, and that eco is in both of them. The economy and the ecology are actually interrelated to one another. So he says he looks at 5 to 6 different cultural ecologies, and he kind of tries to track them throughout mundane human history. Um, and he starts off with hominization. This is the rise of the modern Homo sapien, and then to symbolization, people starting to use language and starting to use tools and starting to represent their thoughts not only through the spoken word, but also through scribed and written symbols, right? So symbolization and then agriculturalization. And some of y'all that may have taken the eco psych class are familiar with this, but right, this is the period where human beings, instead of roaming, kind of enclose themselves and in different parts of the world, not all parts of the world, in fact, not most, but human beings start to enclose themselves and they start to cultivate seed and and actually transform the environment in a large scale, right, for the purposes of growing their own food. Then you got civilization, and civilization in this way really means the building of cities, right? You got your great civilizations. You got Egypt, you have ancient China, you have Mesopotamia, right? You have the civilizations of the Americas, the pyramid builders, and so on. And then industrialization, right? The 15th century to the present, or excuse me, to 1994. And industrialization, one of the keys here is it's not just simple machines, right? It's not just a tool like a hammer. It's tools, interlocking sets of tools, you might say. And industrialization is also coeval with this period of colonization um, that we're studying so much about. And then finally, you've got planetization, which he starts in 1945 to the present, and that's really with the detonation of the first atomic weapons. And in his view, that was a sort of beginning of a new era um, in terms of these cultural ecologies. And I think this term planetization is an interesting one, and I think it's one that has a lot of connection to what people are referring to now as the Anthropocene. Geologists are referring to as the Anthropocene, right? It's this sort of idea that human beings have spread all over the planet Earth, and that human activity is kind of coextensive with the globe, and also that our symbol systems are global and are basically having an effect on the ecology of the entire planet. And so he's got these kind of like major um, structural transformations that have happened to humanity, or that humanity has initiated in some cases. And then he talks about sort of on the right side, different ecological embeddednesses that each one of those kind of transformations heralded, right? So, you got your riverine, your ancient civilizations that were really based off of the flow of large bodies of water and rivers like the Nile and whatnot. Um, you have your transcontinental civilizations where, people are moving across seas and, the Silk Route and these kinds of like large scale trade routes that are happening between peoples, civilizations like Rome, for example. You have your oceanic, right? And your oceanic is like the transatlantic slave trade, right? The what was known as the Atlantic world, you know, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, right? And the movement of people and goods and foods and, you know, what's called the Columbian Exchange, right? And then you have your biospheric, okay? And he calls these planetary noetic polities, right? And again, the biospheric stage is, it involves the whole of the physical earth. It involves the air space, the atmosphere. It involves the hydrosphere. It involves the chemical makeup of the soil. And now our human societies are so large and are so comprehensive in our effect on the earth that we are now interfering with the homeostasis of the environment itself, right? So we're all well aware of some of these. So the Noetic Polities. So some qualities of these Noetic Polities that Thompson identifies. There's a shift of identity from logical definitions to participation and performance, right? So it's not so much about building a mental structure that holds your identity. It's really more about being a part of something and doing, or even playing, right? And Thompson was also he was influenced by Marshall McLuhan, who was a media scholar from the 1950s to the 1980s, and he coined the term "the medium is the message." So he was really looking at not just the content that is communicated over media, but the way that that content is packaged via different types of media, right? So this is kind of what we talked about in terms of orature and literature. Like, what capacities does literature have to package information and to structure perception? And what capacities does the spoken word have to capture information and structure perception? Okay. So what Thompson was looking at was a shift from literature to electronic communication, from print-based communication to electronic communication. And he said in that shift, we move from logical definitions of print to being caught up in media stories and the transmission of information as a doing. He also talks about the transformation of political nationalism to artistic nationalism. Now just dig that for a second. Artistic nationalisms. Right? So it's almost like instead of it being about a flag in a country, it's about competing styles of music, right? Competing styles of fashion, competing styles of slang, right? Competing attitudes, right? And that those political nationalisms are really kind of contained within borders, but artistic nationalisms can stride over borders, right? And that brings us to the next one, is from objects separated in space to presences in an interpenetrating field, right? And some of this goes with some of the discoveries in science in terms of like Newtonian physics to quantum physics, where in the Newtonian world, the atom is a discrete object, and in the quantum world, the atom is a sort of vibrating presence where it's an orbit, okay? And I think a lot of this is interesting in terms of the conversation around materialism as the West, spiritualism as the East, and personalism as the South. Another piece, there's an almost cybernetic quality to the Noetic Polities. I mean, we're doing it now, right? He says, machines that were once external to us are now becoming intimate architectures in our involvement with other minds, bodies, cultures, and heavenly bodies, right? So like you and I are communicating over a distance, and it's only possible because of this whole electronic setup, and the pandemic is like exacerbating this even more, right? So we're kind of enmeshed in these electronic environments, and this is becoming how we communicate as human beings. Look at the kids today. Look at how they relate to their phones, right? Like kids are using phones. Like my kids walk around with their phones and they don't put them down. It's like a staff, right? Like at what other point in history have human beings walked with an object in their hands all the time? Okay, just something to think about. Morphogenesis. Now, this is kind of more how I see it, and these are like coming less directly from him, but sort of understandings that I'm trying to fuse together. So, morphogenesis, or spontaneous and synchronous parallel behavior, thought, and feeling across spatial distances. Okay, and this is like when George Floyd's the video of his murder spread across the country and really across the world. There were uprisings in urban spaces and even in rural spaces all over the world, especially in the United States, but all over the world. Okay. And morphogenesis, that term comes from another fellow British scientist named Rupert Sheldrake. And his observation was that, and this is a disputed one in the scientific, Euroscientific community, that you can find sometimes scientific developments will happen in separate parts of the world at around the same time. People make breakthroughs at around the same time. He studied animal behavior and he found that animals would often, they would be in laboratories, say in New York and in London, and you'd put a rat through a maze. And the same species of rat, once one made it through the maze, on the other side of the Atlantic, the other one would make it through in shortly after. Right. So the idea is that there's some information that can be shared across spaces, even without even things like electronic communication. Right. So it's like people are kind of are acting in simultaneity, even though they're separated across or separated by physical distance. Another quality of Noetic Polities is nations are becoming more fictions and imaginative stories that we're telling ourselves than they are like physical locations. And as a nation becomes a fiction, your allegiance to the nation is basically whether or not you identify with and participate and perform that story. Um, Reintegration of spirituality, science, and art. I don't think I need to say much there with Naropa, the kind of work that we're doing here. Um, Informational and spiritual lattice rather than territorial extensions and borders. Okay. So this term lattice, it's like a web. So instead of a country, we got these maps of the earth broken up into these blocked land masses with these artificial borders. In many cases, we have these distributed networks of information, of people, of the flow of goods. And this is really how human beings are organizing themselves around the planet in this time, he says, in the biospheric or in the plantization era. Um, Another one, this is kind of coming more from me, access rather than ownership, right? There's that a lot of car makers are predicting that if cars become self-driving, people are going to stop buying them. They're just going to rent them. They'll just have Uber come pick them up, especially since it's not even going to be driven by a real person, right? So why have the liability, right? So there's an opportunity to shift from private ownership, especially of a lot of large scale, electronic infrastructure and whatnot, but to switch from private ownership to being able to have access to uh, resources or tools when needed. And then the final one, which Thompson actually talks a lot about, is the recycling of pollution into nutrient and noise into information, right? And this is a really deep one that I can't even go into very much, but he basically says that societies perceive their own pollution and waste as evil, and they try to externalize it and put it outside of themselves. And that evil or pollution or noise or what's called evil is often an indicator of a new, like once it gets to a point where it can't be walled off, right? Like even if we talk about the flow of migrants and immigrants and refugees, they're putting holes through the traditional notion of nations, right? And from a nationalism based consciousness, territorial based consciousness, this is seen as evil. But Thompson is like that noise or that pollution of these people who cross borders is actually an indicator of new social formation, right? Okay. All right. So another entity that is kind of pushing us, according to Thompson and Naomi Klein, that's pushing us towards these noetic polities is the multinational corporation. And in No Logo, Naomi Klein talks about how the multinational corporation, not only is it, you know, sourcing labor and parts and raw materials from all over the planet, it's also corporations move from being primarily producers, according to Klein, to really being these like, you know, to creating brands and creating brand identities and franchise identities through brands, right? Telling stories about themselves and creating feelings in the consumers and people feeling like they were a part of something, and therefore you have your kind of base of customer loyalty because people want to feel like they're involved, again, participating in a story, right? And so, you know, we all know the ubiquitous environment of brandings. It's in all of our, you know, digital and media and social media interfaces. It's displayed all over the environment. Um, the, you know, the physical space of an urban or suburban place. Um, and Thompson actually has this interesting point, and I think this is really interesting, just language wise, from an Afrofuturist point of view. But he sees that in the Noetic era, that language will really become almost more hieroglyphic, right? Almost more ideographic, symbols that communicate multiple levels of meaning. Okay. Now look at our emojis in addition to logos, right? Look at our t-shirts with all these symbols we walk around with, right? So the idea is that you can package information visually and it has multiple levels of meaning, and that people can just like identify those meanings even without being literate, so to speak, right? Super interesting to think about in terms of Afrofuturist terms. Okay, so Thompson also um, he was also looking at the culture of California in the 1970s, during the kind of heyday of the counterculture, and maybe we might say during the first wave of uprising and like evolutionary spike towards a noetic polity or towards noetic polities. And he was looking at he was looking at the Black Panthers, right, in Oakland, and he was looking at the hippies in San Francisco, and he was looking at the situationalists in France, right? And what he was seeing was that the ways that these new cultural movements were interacting with their environment and the ways that they were doing politics and the ways that they were doing art were sort of more indicative of these noetic participatory cultures than they were of the literate definition and kind of read and form an opinion type cultures, right? So he says bourgeois, national, and industrial culture will be replaced by the triumph of a new religious sensibility. And I'm going to skip a little. He says, in which case the American black man, with his lack of a nation, is not behind us, but ahead of us. The whites, exulting in the work ethic, always saw the black man as the pre industrial past. It never occurred to them that he could be the post industrial future. Right? So he starts to say, look, maybe unemployment is actually can actually be turned into an advantage. And maybe the the black liberationalist and the black hippie and the white hippie and whatnot, maybe they've actually broken through into a new way of doing things. And that we don't actually want to have jobs per se. We want to have roles, right? We want to be a part of a story more so than a part of a corporate entity, right? More so than a cog in a machine. We want to be like in an archetypal story that we're working with, right? So just to in the center there, you know, you got this gorgeous black hippie woman just kind of giving us the rainbow of tomorrow, and on the right there, you got Watts Towers, which were built in the wake of the Watts riots, right? Um, so just this idea that actually the ghetto or the hood or the places where people were most disenfranchised were the least attached to the old systems and the most prepared to transform and to be responsive to something new. And I think that's also important in light of the value of improvisation and the fluidity with which Black people, as in terms of cultural values, live our lives, right? So, in a time where there's constant change, that capacity to improvise and to play and to be in it, right? Because improvisation doesn't have a script like scripted music. It's like you have to go off script and you have to work on your feelings and you have to be paying attention to the whole situation. You know? So, interesting piece there. Speaking of participatory cultures and myths and blackness, at one point in my life, I had the benefit of being around a lot of roster brethren, and they really, a couple, I should say, a couple of influential uh, bearers of Rastafari, and they really put this idea to me that Rastafari was a living myth, and you know the way that the Rastafari dealt with the biblical tradition is they didn't just read scripture and wait for prophecy to come true. They saw themselves as living in the times of prophecy and as being the enactors of prophecy, as making prophecy come true through their action and through their being. A friend of mine said, he said, we're living oracles, right? So, like, we're the prophecy, like, we're the ones that give the prophecy and then we embody it, right? Quote by Bob Marley, just something deep to think about. I think, especially these days when we are so separated physically, spatially. So, speaking of participatory Black cultures, of Black Noetic Polities, hip hop, right? And this kind of graph here sort of shows, it's just sort of mapping like the names of various MCs, right? Does it have Black in it, right? And then they go to Black Milk, Black Alicious, you know, Gangsta Black, Black Thought, right? Or is it based on a virtue such as authenticity? And then it's like the realist or Latif, the truth speaker, or does it have Sleepy in it? Or, you know, so they kind of just created this like information node to try to map out um, or information lattice to try to map out all these different nodes of the proliferation of the names of MCs. So at this point, I think it's old news that hip hop is an international phenomenon and uh, really appeals to uh, Black people, obviously, in the United States, and Black people in the diaspora, and Black people in the African continent. Um, but it also appeals to international audiences of all, you know, ethnic and racial varieties, you know, across the spectrum. And you know, just like rock and roll actually, and just like jazz and just like funk, right? Like this latest wave of black music, hip hop, um, it's a global phenomenon, and it's a global form of communication, or rather, I should say, it's a planetary form of communication, right? And it's kind of like this map of the urban landscape, and also this map of the experience of oppressed and downtrodden people, this map of like post-colonial living, and this map of electronic and digital and industrial living, and living like at this sort of like this like heavy polyrhythmic pace, right? And how we filter all that through understanding, and how we develop orature around it, and how we navigate space through orature. Yeah. So, anyways, and Thompson says here on the bottom that like Turkish teenagers and black and Latino kids in the Bronx are like signaling each other, right, across the electronic medium. So that's that sort of noetic lattice that is it's identity that's based on on participation more than it is on territory, transnational. So just a little bit of demographics about hip hop on a planetary level. Um, 37 point, and this study comes from 2015, so things have probably changed a bit, but 37.1% of 15 to 25-year olds in China love hip hop, or about 296 million people total. Um, Hip hop is estimated to be a $500 billion a year industry, and that's like the annual spending power that hip hop has. Um, it's probably equal to or bigger than the spending power of some nations. Um, they kind of talk about the demographic range and ethnic and racial range of people who are hip hop fans, as well as like the age range. Um, and it says at 15%, the 35 to 44 year old listening segment is also the also large for this demographic, right? So hip hop actually seems to be growing up, you might say. And as like Generation X goes into their sort of maturity and midlife phase, people are still listening to hip hop, as well as millennials and Gen Z folks. I think another one at the bottom that's kind of interesting is there's this idea that most of the hip hop market is white, and according to this source, that was a little bit, of a fallacy. And it talks about how white people were really in the United States were really listening to a lot of gangster rap, and according to this source, the hip hop market is actually across various ethnicities: black, brown, indigenous, and international. So, I kind of, again, I'm just trying to make the point that it's hip hop is like like they said, it's an artistic nationalism. It's a stylistic nationalism. Now, this whole question of nationalism, you might recognize Erica Badu on the left and Talib Kweli on the right, and these are just kind of lyrics from some of their music. And Badu was kind of building on John Lennon's statement that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, right? And again, this is at the beginning. Rock and roll, the blues, and jazz are kind of the beginning of the electronic um, noetic era, you might say. And so she's building on that statement. Hip hop's bigger than religion, right? It's bigger than the government, right? It's ubiquitous. It's all over the world. It's a movement that can't be contained by national borders. It can't be contained by racial and ethnic differences. It can't be contained by religious differences. It's like a virus, right? It's like this boogie pattern that is just traveling around the planet and infecting people. And like, because why? It resonates with people's situation, right? Whereas Talib Kweli's like, he's like, hip hop's not a nation. Just look at it. Okay. We don't even have our own territory. We're locked inside the belly of the beast. We don't have our own territory. We don't have our own space. And I think he raises a really good question in terms of this idea of noetic polities and hip hop and Black culture and Black diasporic culture, like say in America, Black people as a stateless nation. His question is, you know, if you don't have your own territory, well, how do you eat? You know, where's your property? How do you have control over the basics of human life? Right? Because sometimes people and we didn't really get into this in the Eurofuture segment, but this idea of the singularity, sometimes people think that we are going to transcend the body and become pure information, and that's that. And maybe that's so, or maybe that whole idea is a delusion. But the fact is right now we're still flesh and blood beings, right? We are still rooted to the earth by our mouths and by our stomachs. And so Kwali is like, we think hip hop's a nation, but we're still inside of the thing that's trying to destroy us and digest us. So on the one hand, Badu, hip hop is this phenomenon, this movement. Literally, there's a kind of movement that goes through people and travels through people. It's like an infection, except it's an infection that heals. Whereas Kwali is like, we have this conceit that we're a nation, but really, what do we actually have? Okay. So I say all this in part to really get us thinking about the possibilities of now as Afrofuturists, as Afrofuturist thinkers, as ethnofuturists, okay? And in a way, I'll call Thompson an ethnofuturist too, because part of what he was really working on was trying to bring in Irish and kind of that kind of bardic tradition into his work. So we can put him on the side of the family of ethnofuturisms, um, to really to get us to start to imagine what are the possibilities of now. What are the possibilities for social formation now? What are the possibilities for spiritual contact now? What are the possibilities for artistic creativity now? What are the economic possibilities now that didn't exist 20, 50, 100 years ago? And depending on how we play things, may not exist 20, 50, 100 years from now. And you see here in the pictures, the shanty megastructures, uh, kind of this like imaginary, shanty town projected and writ large architectures, or shanty town mixed up with Disney World. And also on the right, another Disney situation, because Disney's trying to capture the collective imagination and own it, by the way. Okay. This is Wakanda, the cityscape of Wakanda from the Black Panther movie. And I bring those up for a couple of reasons. I don't know, some of you who are nerds like me may have watched all the Marvel movies, and in Thor 3, this is going deep nerd, but in Thor 3, the mythic city of Asgard, which is like in outer space, gets destroyed. And so Thor makes this statement that Asgard isn't just a city, it's not just a place, it's an idea. And I think if we look at how Black people responded to Black people across the world, and not just Black people, a lot of indigenous peoples, a lot of, Latin American peoples, a lot of peoples in Asia responded to the Wakandan myth, this projection of this Black utopia, right? This projection of this kind of Black Atlantis, or like this invisible city, right? There's a sort of myth that there's these etheric cities all around the globe, right? Chogyam Trungpa used it. Shambhala, it's this invisible city. It's this enlightened city, right? So Wakanda is like another one of these invisible cities appearing over the African continent. And not just in the African continent, but in the African collective psyche, and not just in the African collective psyche, but the world collective psyche. Okay. And like, just watch how Black people did it, right? Watch all the dances that came out. Watch the way that people start putting on makeup. People really started to inhabit Afrofuturists once Black Panther hit. And now we can make a lot of arguments about Black Panther and the compromises maybe that the directors made, putting it through Disney. Remember, it's Disney. They're trying to own the imagination. They're trying to own folklore from all over the world. They're trying to uh, bleach it out and whiteify it, right? But even with all those compromises, Wakanda did something to the collective imagination, and the filmmakers were smart because in the end, Ryan Coogler, right? He had T'Challa and Shuri go to Oakland and start a school, almost as if to plant the seed in the imagination, right, of Oakland to start real schools. Okay. I'm just going to briefly reference the Wakanda Dream Lab, which is a project that's coming out of Oakland. I know it is associated with the Movement Strategy Center in Oakland, but really they're actively involved in imagining Black futures on political, artistic, scientific, economic levels, ecological levels. So I put that out there as is Wakanda a noetic polity, regardless of what we call it. But is there an artistic nationalism? Is there a space of spiritual attunement and imaginative attunement that we can lock into and try to manifest or play or perform into reality? Final couple of quotes from Thompson here. And he says, images are generated through a process of deep contemplative attunement to the creative silences of the realm of imagination. Right. So again, that's that noetic quality. When we sit, or when we dance, or when we make music, or when we make art, there's that Black space from which, the creative, the imaginative, the inspired, the rhythmic pulse and move. Okay. So part of what a noetic polity is yes, it's electronic technology. You know, yes, it's the distributing currency across the globe or across networks, right? But it is also the the attunement of collectives into different imaginal fields or clusters, right? And that's kind of what I was picturing, as almost these like cities, these like floating crystal cities that kind of hang over different parts of the earth. And if you attune to their frequencies, you can enter into those cities, and then you can bring back, you might say, artifacts from those cities in the form of images, in the form of ideas, in the forms of music, in the forms of movement, and so on, fashion, so on. So I'm pretty much at the end of my lecture, and now by this point I've gone way out into space and into invisible cities and into all kinds of stuff. And people are like, wait, what? Isn't this supposed to be academia? But a lot of these themes we're going to continue and pick up when we look at Afrofuturism as political organization, looking at organizations and, from the lens of Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, non-hierarchical organizations and what have you. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop this presentation, or the screen share piece of it. And just some concluding thoughts. Do you feel yourself to be part of a noetic polity? Do you feel yourself to be part of a new nation? Or maybe an ancient nation that is on the rise? or maybe a hidden nation? Do you see yourself as participating in a myth that can be lived, in a story that can be lived? Are you at home in the story that you live? And what's the relationship between what you imagine in your depths and what you actually manifest and play out in your life? And can we do the game of imagination collectively? And we might also ask ourselves, what role does music play in that? How does music help us enter into collective imaginings and collective performances? Well, okay, I have said too much. I hope there is some value here for you. This is an optional lecture. It's not required on any level. This is just free sources, and this is for your edification and inspiration. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm happy to, if you want to comment on this or you want to put anything in the chat, the class chat, please put it in the chat, or we can bring it into our conversation the next time we see one another. So with that,